Hi, everybody. Welcome back. Today, we're going to be looking at popular sovereignty, not in the way that you probably learned it back in civics when talking about the Constitution, but popular sovereignty as the phrase that was going to solve all the problems about the contestation over slavery moving west in the last decade leading up to the American Civil War. So today we want to be able to look at the outcome of gaining all the land with the Mexican Cession and how the issue of slavery and how it's unresolved throughout the antebellum period will ultimately lead us to the greatest, bloodiest conflict in American history, starting in 1861. So you can see from our map that the United States has expanded tremendously in the 5 decades following the Louisiana Purchase. Not only now do we have Texas as annexed in 1845, but we have the Mexican Cession and then the Oregon Territory, which by 1846 is also part of the United States with a finalized northern boundary at the 49th parallel. But the United States now is a continental United States. And up through 1848, slavery had moved west. It had moved into places like Missouri and Arkansas. It had moved into Texas even before it was annexed. And so the question was, could slavery move into this Mexican Cession? And the country will become greatly divided in trying to answer that question. So there are other items besides just the Wilmot Proviso that David Wilmot tried to put forth in 1846 before we even began the war with Mexico about this issue of where slavery would be prohibited in the United States. The first time was with the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. Thomas Jefferson, in deciding that that land should be divided in no more than 5, but no less than 3 potentially new states to the Union, said they would be areas of land where slavery could not exist. And this was not a disunifying event. Americans accepted that that's where slavery would not go. However, 50 years later, with the Wilmot Proviso, it couldn't pass in the United States Senate because of this pro-slavery faction that was so well represented. So today we want to look at, ultimately in the antebellum period, why is there something that at the beginning of our nation's history was acceptable, a place where slavery could not exist, but that idea didn't seem acceptable by the time we get to 1850. So the aftermath of the Mexican-American War is that we gain a lot of land and we have no resolution about the issue of slavery. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which brings in the Mexican Cession, creates all sorts of issues because within a year of signing this treaty, gold will be discovered at a place called Sutter's Mill, California, and we will begin to see in 1849 the Great California Gold Rush. Also at the same time, we are going to have a Congress where more and more members of the House of Representatives are going to be on the side of abolition, or certainly the side of what was known as free soil. They didn't want to see slavery expanding west. And there was no longer a gag rule. The pro-slave power in Congress was not able to manage to maintain that kind of authority after 1844. So now we have a place in national politics where slavery will finally be discussed. The California Gold Rush will create a huge migration of Americans out to California and what is the San Francisco area today, and other people from around the world, all seeking gold. California had relatively few people. They had missions created during the time that it was a Spanish holding. You saw Aboriginal or indigenous people who occupied certain portions of Western California. But for the most part, it was very sparsely populated. But in the course of a year, nearly 100,000 people came out to California searching for gold. The vast majority of people didn't actually find gold, but other people did make money. They made money by becoming merchants, selling supplies, to these would-be miners. You saw other people who made money simply by helping bring these miners to California. So the people who go out there, for the most part, are looking for opportunity. They are not bringing slaves with them. And so unlike Texas, which was established for the production of cotton, you are seeing California have its origin with free people looking for their own personal financial gain. Because so many people move out to California, by 1850, it is seeking statehood. And this is where the issue of slavery and all of this land that's been acquired by the Mexican Cession is going to create continued political conflict in American life. So as we've looked throughout this course, Henry Clay was the great compromiser, and he's a pretty old man by 1850, but the same man who could bring about compromise over tariffs, the father of the American system, the instigator of what will be the Missouri Compromise of 1820. In 1850, when California wants to seek statehood and be a free state, he is one of three people who will help broker a compromise that they hope will be as long-lasting as the Missouri Compromise. Unfortunately, it will be farther short-lived. But Henry Clay, along with Daniel Webster, who was also a Whig, and a rising young politician named Stephen Douglas of Illinois, who was a Democrat, are going to put together a 5-part deal. 5 laws create the Compromise of 1850, and like all compromises, the idea is that both sides of the issue will be satisfied. So we're going to create a compromise that will hopefully satisfy the issues of an interest of free states and of pro-slavery states. So in order for California to be admitted as a free state, the pro-slavery faction in Congress demanded something that would further strengthen their power over the issue of slavery. And that becomes a new fugitive slave law. Now, if you remember, in the Constitution, there actually is a fugitive slave clause. Even though people spoke about free states, if you were a runaway slave, simply going to a free state did not give you your freedom. However, most free states did very little or nothing to enable slave owners to get their property back. However, with this new Fugitive Slave Act, now you will see that every white person living in a free state was ultimately legally liable for the return of a slave owner's property. The reaction to this is in quite a few free states, they will pass personal liberty laws. So although most northern states typically were on the side of the federal government and its lawmaking powers, this is going to be an instance where we're going to see northern states exert states' rights. But personal liberty laws were based on the idea that if you lived in a free state or managed to get to a free state, that you then had personal liberty, and you would no longer, at least within that free state, be recognized as an enslaved person. A third law that will be passed will have to do with the Mexican Cession itself. Texas was incredibly large when originally annexed in 1845, and the concern was that you would have a state that, if it could fill up with people, would be much larger than many of the older original states, places like Connecticut and Rhode Island. And so the physical size of Texas needed to be reduced, and we get the modern boundaries of New Mexico and Texas at that time. A fourth law will be the abolition of the slave trade in Washington, D.C. So there were several cities in the United States that had large slave markets: New Orleans, Natchez, Mississippi, Charleston, South Carolina, and Washington, D.C. especially for foreign travelers. It was very upsetting that they would be walking through Washington, D.C., and literally saw human beings penned up in what was supposedly the capital of the freest place in the Western world. Slavery was alive and well. In fact, the slave market of Washington, D.C. is where the Great Mall is today. It was in the center of the city, and on public display. And so both pro-slavery advocates and free staters saw that this was an issue and saw that essentially it should be removed, taken out of the public eye. And so ultimately that is why the pro-slavery contingent was willing to abolish the slave trade in Washington, D.C. Unfortunately, slavery itself continued to be legal. And then the last piece of this compromise was that Utah and New Mexico territories would now become places of popular sovereignty to decide the slavery issue. And this is one of the major problems that give rise to the American Civil War. With the Compromise of 1850, the United States Congress absolved itself from any responsibility about the slavery issue. It was now going to be the people's decision. So with popular sovereignty, you would simply have an area, a territory, where once 60,000 people were established and it applied for statehood, the people in that territory at that time would decide whether or not slavery would be the law of the state or not. Why divide this between Utah and New Mexico? Well, again, this was seen as sort of a bargain. Utah was mostly inhabited by Mormons. Mormons were anti-slavery. They had probably close to 60,000 people by the 1850s and were not likely to ever become a slave state. However, New Mexico, adjacent to Texas, and a place where you could, in theory, grow short staple cotton, was far more likely to become potentially a future slave state. But the idea of popular sovereignty was one in which Congress thought if the people had to decide, simply these issues would go away. They would no longer be so contentious at the national level. Unfortunately, that's not the case. As time goes on, we see not a lack of leadership in the executive branch and essentially a lack of leadership in the legislative branch by 1850. And we'll see the judicial branch also kind of give up its moral authority on the slavery issue before the decade is out. But you can see on our map here with the Compromise of 1850 that we still have a large section of unorganized territory north of the 3630 line in the Louisiana Purchase. But the Mexican Cession essentially has been decided. California, a free state, New Mexico and Utah territory, through popular sovereignty, potentially at some point will be making that decision. But this, again, is a compromise that will find itself tested within 4 years of its creation. So the electoral politics of the decade prior to the Civil War is going to be one in which the leadership, particularly people like Webster and Clay and Calhoun, are going to die. By 1852, you will no longer have those three giants representing two very distinctive viewpoints, but willing to come back from time to compromise. After 1852, we have a new group of politicians, some whom are incredibly pragmatic and are willing to allow slavery to exist if it will serve their ends, others who are heartened by the idea that more and more people seem to recognize the need for abolition and are willing to make this a national issue, and then a further entrenched Southern Democrat wing that will not compromise on the issue of slavery and insist that it goes west. The second party system begins to essentially dissolve. The Whig Party between 1848 and 1854 will find itself incredibly fractured over this slavery issue for a couple of reasons. In 1848, the candidate that the Whig Party decides should be the presidential candidate is Zachary Taylor, the great general of the Mexican-American War. But he was also originally from Louisiana and a slave owner. He'd never even run for political office, perhaps not even ever voted. But what's this idea of waving the bloody shirt? Throughout American history, we have seen a pattern where generals, people who were seen as great leaders in a previous military conflict that America prevailed in, will find themselves nominated and often win the presidency. But the abolitionist wing of the Whig Party cannot vote for Taylor and splits off. Many of those people are looking to have a political party that is adamant that slavery doesn't spread west. And so we see a free soil party evolve. And this party existed mostly for white Americans who did not want to see their paid labor have to compete with the free labor of slavery. Unfortunately, most free soilers were not about abolition solely for the sake of human liberty, but the idea that slavery simply didn't spread west. But we will find that the abolitionist wing of the Whig Party will certainly be able to make some compromises and agree with at least the premise of the Free Soil Party about slavery not spreading west. We also have the American Party, which was that know-nothing party, that nativist party that starts to rise in the 1840s. It's going to be very strong, particularly in Massachusetts and New York, where there is a large Irish Catholic population. Ultimately, as a third party, they are anti-immigrant, and they are looking to see the national government create some kind of restrictions on immigration. So in the election of 1848, we can see that the Whig Party does win, but it is going to be the last time that the Whig Party will prevail. And the vote is all over the place simply because we have a lot of different factions at this point. And many of the Democratic votes that we'll see, even in places like Illinois and Indiana, they come from the fact that Lewis Cass, who was the Democratic candidate, he didn't call it popular sovereignty, he called it squatter sovereignty. But he was articulating this idea that the national government shouldn't have to decide on slavery, but individuals did. And at least theoretically in 1848, that resonated with people who were afraid that if we continued to make slavery a national issue, we were going to bring ourselves closer to civil war. As you can see, by 1852, the Democratic Party will prevail. But again, it's not necessarily that we see a large pro-slavery movement in the North. It's simply that the Whig Party is so fractured, it cannot get enough votes electorally. So the Compromise of 1850 is something that people hoped would last as long as the Missouri Compromise. In effect, it was contentious from its inception, and by 1854 will become even more problematic. Even though slavery doesn't go west, these are debates. There are other issues that are being handled by Congress at that time, and they actually have to do with trade. We go back to these ideas of nationalism versus sectionalism. But again, Manifest Destiny is a nationalistic ideal, and the idea that the United States would have productive capacity to participate in ever increasing amounts of global trade, very important to the economic health of the country. And the rise of the railroad and its ability to further create efficiency and link markets. The railroad by 1850 is something that could, in theory, traverse the entire United States because we are from sea to shining sea. That had not happened yet, but Northern industrialists see that there is no longer a reason why the railroad should end at St. Louis and where the Mississippi lies, that we could be going over the Mississippi and literally connecting Pacific nations across the ocean to the continental United States and then again across the Atlantic to Europe. That this was all incredibly feasible. The technology was there. It would just be the investment of money.
Teachers, pardon the interruption. If you park in the loading dock, we ask that you please remove your car and
So northern industrialists at this time are looking at the idea of building a transcontinental railroad. They also want to ensure that there will be the possibility of this trans-Pacific trade. So two things need to happen. The first one is, where do we build the railroad? And for many, it made the most sense that this railroad would actually be built across the southern portions of the West, in part because there were less elevation changes, less temperature changes, all real issues about the primitive construction of railroads. But certainly northern representatives in Congress didn't like the idea that this was essentially taking their influence, particularly in lawmaking at that time, out of play. That they wanted to see that not necessarily that you had a railroad connecting the South continentally, but that you would have a railroad that would connect the North continentally. But in order to make this railroad possible, potentially, we actually had to buy more land from Mexico. So the boundaries of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo were of the Rio Grande and the Gila River. But this railroad was going to have to traverse south of that to link up with what would become Los Angeles. And so we make the Gadsden Purchase in 1853, which is an additional purchase of land to make this railroad possible. This railroad will not be built for decades to come. And actually, the national government will be far more interested in building a northern railroad, and that will be what will prevail. But we still make the land purchase nonetheless. The other piece of this is having a trade partner in the Pacific. And we begin to see in the 1840s and 1850s a pattern amongst the Western European nations as they begin to create spheres of influence, particularly in China. And the United States is looking to have its own trade partner. And we force a trade partnership with Japan in 1853. We enlist Commodore Perry, who was the highest ranking officer at the time in the Pacific. And he takes a fleet that goes into Japan and essentially blockades its harbor with warships, coming on a mission of peace, supposedly, to create a trade agreement, but one under potentially a lot of firepower. But we make an agreement, will become the Treaty of Takagawa with Japan in 1853, and we become the sole Western trading partner of Japan at that time. In addition, there is this other issue. You've seen on maps over the last couple of units that there's this unorganized territory in the Louisiana Purchase north of what is Missouri today. And that was because that region was actually considered permanent Indian territory. In fact, not so permanent, because by 1854, Congress is looking to exchange that land for something else in order to have a northern rail line that goes across the United States. So Southerners, they're looking to connect New Orleans to California. Northerners are hoping to connect either Chicago to California or St. Louis to California. But either way, this is going to be a transcontinental railroad that is much farther north than where the Gadsden Purchase and that southern rail line was originally planned. So how do we make it possible to take permanent Indian territory and make it something else? Well, that will come from this man, Stephen Douglas, who was part of that triumvirate that brokered the Compromise of 1850. He was a Democrat from Illinois, not pro-slavery, but certainly didn't stand against slavery spreading west. And he was looking to see that he could help his constituents. He was from the city of Chicago, which was just starting to grow into a metropolis in this time period. He believed that its success was going to be if it could become essentially the spur for this transcontinental railroad. So he devises something that becomes known as the Kansas-Nebraska Act. He wants to nullify the Missouri Compromise. So this idea that slavery will never be found above that 3630 line in the Louisiana Purchase. He says, no, if popular sovereignty would work for Utah and New Mexico potentially, why can't it work for this new area that will be the Kansas Territory and the Nebraska Territory? So these two new territories are created. Native people in the plains are given what are the Dakotas in exchange. And potentially we will have two new states in the future where whether or not they have slavery will be decided by the people who settle there. Kansas will be the area that first will have settlement, and it will be a contentious 2 years of bloodshed. In particular, because Kansas is essentially adjacent to Missouri. So you will see many pro-slavery people who are in Missouri who are looking to settle in Kansas so that they can quickly establish statehood, and that is pro-slavery. However, we are going to see Northerners, particularly abolitionists, who believe that they now have a mission from God to go to Kansas themselves and make it a free state. And what evolves is 2 years known as Bleeding Kansas. So the pro-slavery Missourians are flooding into Kansas territory, but we are also going to see organized abolitionists. One group known as the New England Immigrant Aid Society. They are going to fundraise through churches, politically through the Free Soil Party, to move to Kansas. And ultimately, you had two armed factions. You actually had churches giving people not only the money and basic supplies to go out to Kansas, but also arming them. They believed that they might be fighting a holy war in the name of abolition. There was lots of fighting and ultimately murder even. In Lawrence, Kansas, you had a group of abolitionists who were murdered by a pro-slavery faction. And in retaliation, this man, John Brown, he, his sons, and several of his followers went to a pro-slavery community at Pottawatomie Creek, and they murdered the community there. So bloodshed was common, and it really won't end until this issue comes truly back to the nation's capital, at which point we will see that there will be a need to step in and perhaps provide some kind of way of diffusing the situation. But in 1856, we have another election, new presidential candidates. James Buchanan, who's a Democrat, will win, but you can see he is now winning only the states that are in the South and those that kind of border the Ohio River. The person who will be running for this new party that's created called the Republican Party, John C. Fremont, who helped free California during the Mexican-American War, he will be someone who is running as an abolitionist. And this will be the beginnings of a new party in which abolition of slavery, and certainly slavery not spreading west, will be major platform ideas. So the political divisions that come up are partly to do with the fact that Democrats are going to be winning seats in Congress and are going to be winning the presidency in 1852 and 1856. But again, because there is this fractured Whig party. But we will see after 1856, although the Republicans don't win in the first time that they seek a presidential office, they are beginning to build a constituency. And part of that will come out of two events of the late 1850s. The first one is known as the Sumner-Brooks Affair. So in 1856, we have Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts, who was an ardent abolitionist. He was a supporter of the American Anti-Slavery Society, a friend of William Lloyd Garrison, and he will make it a part of his practice to, every time there is violence in Kansas, to take the floor of the Senate and to read the names of the victims, and then read the names of who he believed were responsible for their injury or their death. And that was the name of every senator who voted for this Kansas-Nebraska Act. He would also then speak about their villainy, their sinfulness, and that they were going to perhaps seek God's retribution at some point. But one of the people that Senator Charles Sumner spoke out against was a senator who was from South Carolina and had had a stroke. He wasn't even present on the day that he was being blamed for the events in Lawrence, Kansas. But nevertheless, there was someone who heard of this and was offended. His name was Congressman Brooks, and his uncle was the man that Senator Charles Sumner was saying was personally responsible for the violence in Kansas. So Congressman Brooks, hearing that his uncle is being denounced in the Senate, comes running across the Capitol building into the Senate chamber, where he takes his cane and begins to beat Charles Sumner around the head, quite violently, causing all kinds of physical damage. Charles Sumner barely lives through the event, has his skull caved in 2 places. And at that point where we have actual bloodshed and violence in Congress, that's the point where you see people begin to realize that something needs to happen. And essentially, there is a stop put on this idea that Kansas, in the immediacy, even if it got 60,000 members to its population, would automatically get to be a state. There were lots of people saying there already were 60,000 people. You had both sides trying to create state constitutions, and Congress put a hold on that, saying that they were going to wait, and they were at no point, at least in the immediate future, going to be taking Kansas as a state, regardless of whether it would be a free state or a slave state. Also, out of this violence, you see that the Republican Party is looking for strong candidates and looking for people who will be able to articulate this message nationally, that slavery does not spread west, and it's a party that is set on stopping that spread of slavery. So the Democratic platform becomes one after 1856 that can be tied to violence, because Congressman Brooks was a Democrat from South Carolina, slave owner himself, and he used violence against a fellow member of Congress who was speaking for the abolition. So the Democratic platform is struggling because not only is it a pro-slavery platform, but the Republicans are able over the next 4 years to tie it to violence and say that they are offering something that perhaps is better for the future of the country. So we want to end today. I want you to think about 3 things. And the first one is, how did the Mexican-American War upset the political balance between free states and slave states, and ultimately the political interests of Americans on either side of that issue? The second thing is, what was the impact of popular sovereignty in the Compromise of 1850 and the Kansas-Nebraska Act? And then the third item is, how did the events of the early 1850s lead to irreconcilable differences in America's political system? Why did this happen in 1850 and not in the 1780s and the 1790s?